Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another YIVO fellowship lecture. Today's Max Weinreich Fellowship Lecture is in American Jewish Studies, and it's supported by the Rose and Isidore Drench Memorial Fellowship and the Dora and Meyer Tendler Endowed Fellowship in Jewish Studies. Once again, thanks for coming. I just want to remind you all to, if you have questions, and we'll be leaving a bit of time at the end for questions, please leave them in the Q&A section, the question and answer section, not the chat, although you can certainly chat during the talk if you'd like. But if you do have a question relevant to the lecture, please leave it in the question and answer section. Today's fellow is Samuel Glauber-Zimra. Sam is a PhD candidate in the Goldstein-Gorin Department of Jewish Thought at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. His dissertation, entitled Occult Modernities, Hidden Realities in Eastern European Jewish Culture, 1880 to 1939, examines the various expressions of modern occultism within the popular culture and religious thought of Eastern European Jewry and its diaspora in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His most recent article, Writings on Spiritualism from the Archive of Reb Eliyahu Mordechai Halevi Volkovsky, appears in the journal Kabbalah, and he is the co-editor of Hillel Zeitlin in The Secret Place of the Soul, 3 Essays, which is published in 2020 in Hebrew. Sam is the 2021-2022 recipient of the Rose and Isidore Drench Memorial Fellowship and the Dora and Meyer Tendler Endowed Fellowship in American Jewish Studies. And I'm hoping that Barbara Drench, the funder of a portion of this fellowship, is in the audience today. She's been a terrific supporter, and we appreciate her help, as well as the Tendler families, very much. We can't do these, we can't present these fellows with funding without them. So today's lecture is entitled, What Does Your Dream Tell You? B. Rivkin and Yiddish Occultism in America. Take it away, Sam.
Thank you, Eddie, for your kind words of introduction, as well as for your continued support of my research over the past several years. I'd like to thank the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research for providing me with this opportunity to share my research with all of you today. Lastly, I'd also like to give a special thank you to the Drench and Tendler families for endowing the fellowship that has supported my research at YIVO. I'm going to take the opportunity to share my screen. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak with you today. What I want to talk about is the story of one man, the Yiddish literary critic Baruch Rivkin, whose particular story can tell us a great deal about a greater, now largely forgotten, cultural moment in early 20th century Jewish history, that of Yiddish occultism. And I'll explain in just another minute what I mean by occultism. Baruch Rivkin is best known today as a prominent member of the American Yiddish left. Yet for over 3 decades of his career in America, he published hundreds of articles on occult subjects under the name Mark Toleros. My talk today addresses, for the first time, Rivkin qua Toleros' writings and activities, which I use as a lens to explore the broader place of occultism in early 20th century Yiddish culture in the US. I'll open by introducing the modern occult revival and its Jewish expressions, as well as with Rivkin's biography and his contributions to modern Yiddish culture. Following that, I will present Rivkin's occult writings published in the Yiddish press under the name Mark Toleros. The pinnacle of Rivkin's Toleros articles, with which I'll be concluding my talk, was his occult dream interpretation column, Vos erzählt euch euer Cholem, What Does Your Dream Tell You?, which ran weekly in the Der Tag Yiddish newspaper from 1942 until Rivkin's death in 1945. Here I will show the significance of occult ideas for Rivkin and his readers as they attempted to grapple with the ongoing crisis of the Holocaust in the early 1940s. But first, what exactly is occultism? The term occultism in the modern context refers to an array of beliefs and practices, oftentimes articulated in scientific language, that seek to engage with hidden dimensions of reality. This could mean hidden knowledge, such as the esoteric doctrines taught by the Theosophical Society, or prophetic foreknowledge received in a dream. It could mean contact with hidden entities, such as séances, held by members of the spiritualist movement who claim to be able to contact the spirits of the dead. It can mean hidden forces, such as the alleged ability of mediums to lift tables and other household objects. It could mean hidden aspects of the personality, accessed through astrology, graphology, or psychic readings. Or it can mean the development of hidden powers through meditation, autosuggestion, or other methods. A widespread occult revival took place across Europe and North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as millions of people became interested in spiritualism, hypnotism, telepathy, new thought, and other occult currents. Many scientists as well sought to investigate occult phenomena in order to discover hitherto unknown psychic forces. These scientific investigations of the occult, today best known as psychical research or parapsychology, were commonly referred to in the interwar period as occultism as well. This scientific conception of the occult is what features most prominently in Rivkin's occult writings. Yiddish-speaking Jews in Eastern Europe and North America took part in this fascination with all things occult. East European Jews conducted spiritualist séances in order to communicate with the spirits of the dead. They flocked to theaters to witness the wonders of hypnotism. They speculated about the possibility of telepathic communication, and they turned to psychic mediums who advised them on their past, present, and future. At a time when traditional religious beliefs were in flux, occultism allowed otherwise skeptical Jews to maintain belief in a higher reality. The story of Jewish occultism is only beginning to be told, and Baruch Rivkin, the subject of my talk today, is a central figure in the story of Yiddish occultism in North America. In his hundreds of articles published under the name Mark Toleros, Rivkin did much to popularize occultism in the American Yiddish press. Even more so, looking beyond the pages of the newspaper, Rivkin corresponded with readers across North America on occult subjects and solicited accounts of paranormal or psychic experiences, in particular dreams, from his readers. Hundreds of such letters are preserved to this day in Rivkin's archive at YIVO. Now let me say a few words to introduce our protagonist, Baruch Rivkin, and his place within the world of Yiddish letters. While I know there might be a few Rivkin scholars in attendance right now, I think it's safe to assume that most listeners are not familiar with him. Rivkin was born in 1883 as Borukh Avrom Weinrebe in Jakobpils, a small city in what is today Latvia that was known to its Jewish residents as Jakobstadt. Like many Yiddish writers and revolutionaries, Rivkin was born into a traditionally observant family and was raised in great poverty. Here you can see a picture of his parents, Ida and Abba Sheftel. The child of a wagon driver, he studied Talmud in Cheder, and in a posthumously published memoir piece, he recalled how, as a boy, he was regarded as an Eloi, a Talmudic prodigy. In fact, he was nearly sent to Berlin to study at the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary. Yet, like so many of his generation, he made a sharp break with tradition, in his case at age 14. And soon after, he began a period of wandering, first in what is today Latvia, and then across the Russian Empire and the great cities of Europe. He lived for various lengths of time in Odessa, Berlin, Hamburg, Paris, London, and Geneva. He took up with the revolutionary cause, joining the Bund in 1903 and subsequently serving a year in Russian prison. It was then, in his early 20s, that Rivkin became a writer, first publishing articles in Russian language and then Yiddish anarchist journals. He immigrated to the US in 1911, settling initially in New York City, where he contributed to various Yiddish literary journals and newspapers, ranging from the political center to the radical left. As a journalist, Rivkin moved from paper to paper, publishing regularly in the nonpartisan Der Tog, the Philadelphia Yiddish daily Yiddische Welt, as well as on the anarchist weekly Freie Arbeiterstimme and the short-lived labor Zionist daily Die Zeit. While initially a member of the Bund, Rivkin's politics were highly eclectic. One common denominator was his frequent call for social revolution. He continued to run in anarchist and socialist circles for the rest of his life, and he was sympathetic to various left-wing social causes. In the 1920s, he advocated for the Jewish farming settlements in the Soviet Union, and he was long enamored by the kibbutz movement in Palestine. For many years, he aligned himself with the Marxist Zionist Poale Zion movement. While Rivkin published several short plays, he made his name as a critic and journalist. He published well-received works of criticism in the most prominent Yiddish literary journals of his day, and he wrote countless articles on contemporary social issues in the Yiddish press. Rivkin lived in great poverty throughout his life, and he did not have the means to publish nearly any books in his lifetime. Many of his writings were edited and published posthumously by his second wife, the Yiddish poet Mina Bordeaux Rivkin, who put out 7 volumes of his writings in the decade following his death in 1945, none of which have been translated into English. There are a few big ideas that Rivkin is known for among scholars. Rivkin's arguably greatest contribution to modern Yiddish culture was his theory of Yiddish literature. He argued that Yiddish literature must strive to serve as a non-territorial homeland for the Jewish people wherever they were found. This pseudo-territory, to borrow Rivkin's own formulation, is often referred to as Yiddish Land, and per his vision would be guided by progressive socialist and egalitarian values, and driven by the force of Yiddish cultural creation. That Rivkin formulated this idea in the late 1930s and early 40s, when Yiddish was rapidly losing ground to English among American Jews, was not lost on his critics. For those interested in visual explorations of Rivkin's pseudo-territory, I highly recommend Paul Buell's chapter on Rivkin in his graphic novel Yiddishkeit, and the Rivkin-inspired pseudo-territory installation at the Venice Yiddish Land Pavilion, created by Ella Ponozovsky-Burgos and Anna Ilana Torres, which is currently viewable online. Rivkin's other great project was theological. In a series of articles gathered and published posthumously in 1947, he articulated what he called NeoMessianism, or later, a belief for unbelievers, an attempt to stake out a middle ground between orthodoxy, which Rivkin saw as no longer intellectually tenable for the Jews of his day, and the nominally atheist radical left that had little interest in religion. Neo-Messianism, in Rivkin's own words from 1929, combines the Jewish religious tradition with lofty poetics, theatricalism, social revolution, and Zionist utopianism, bolstered by psychology and philosophy, and interwoven with experimental mysticism. With these last words, experimental mysticism, we get a hint to the occult activities that so engaged Rivkin. At the center of his theology was the messianic idea, here cast as the potential for each individual to imagine their own Messiah into being and achieve redemption through artistic expression. Rivkin emphasized here the importance of the Jewish holidays, which he called to creatively celebrate with a focus on spectacle and play. I owe much of my knowledge of Rivkin's theological writings to Chaim Rothman, a scholar of Jewish anarchism who has been researching Rivkin's thought for the past several years. Alongside these better-known projects, Rivkin devoted 3 decades of his career to researching occult and psychic phenomena and publicizing this knowledge in the American Yiddish press under the name Mark Toleros. Like many Yiddish writers of his day, Rivkin used several pen names. His primary pen name, so to speak, was B. Rivkin, and it is under this name that all of his books were published. Another pen name, Abba Lillian, was used for theater criticism, and he signed with his birth name, Borukh Avrom Weinrebe, when writing about religious and philosophical topics. While these topical divisions between Rivkin, Lillian, and Weinrebe were not closely followed, for example, literary criticism at times appeared under the name Lillian, and he published many of his theological articles under the name Rivkin, Mark Toleros was an entirely different persona. Toleros articles were only ever about occult or psychic topics, and these occult topics were hardly ever mentioned in the articles published under his other names. Yet, as I will show today, the occult agenda of Mark Toleros was closely entwined with the socio-political aims of B. Rivkin. As an aside, I haven't found anywhere where Rivkin actually explains the meaning of the name Mark Toleros, but several of his readers offer their own creative interpretations in letters to him. My favorites are the English read Toleros as teller us, as in telling us what's going on, and the Hebrew-English hybrid tel raz, as in teller of secrets. It's not totally clear when and where Rivkin was first exposed to modern occultism, as the occult currents that so interested him were highly popular across all of Europe and North America at the turn of the century. In a letter written after her husband's death, Rivkin's widow claims that he first began to engage with dreams while living in London in 1910, although it appears that a concern with the supernatural extends back to his childhood in Jakobstadt. In any case, the first series of Toleros articles appeared in Der Tag beginning in May 1919 and continued to appear in whatever newspaper Rivkin happened to be working for at that given moment. He moved around quite a bit. This first series was titled Von der Geisterwelt, from the spirit world, and presented accounts of paranormal or otherwise unexplainable occurrences. Think premonitions of impending death of a loved one, or two people dreaming the same dream on the same night. Here, for instance, we can see an illustrated article on crystal balls. From his first articles on the occult, Rivkin/Toleros had a fully developed scientific conception of occultism that he maintained with minor variations for the rest of his life. Rivkin's understanding of the occult was highly natural. It was important to him, to whatever degree possible, to find natural explanations for occult phenomena. However, this doesn't mean that he denied the reality of things like mind reading, ghost sightings, or psychic healing. He simply attributed them to hidden or not yet discovered, yet for him entirely natural forces. For Rivkin, all occult phenomena could be traced back to the human mind. He believed that thoughts were physical entities charged with energy that could exert force on the physical world, and in some cases, even be physically materialized. Telepathy, mind cures, and autosuggestion were all manifestations of the psychic powers latent within the human mind. Rivkin's belief in the nearly limitless power of the human mind, which he called Psychotechnics, owes a great deal to several contemporary occult and psychological trends. Most important of these were first, New Thought, an American metaphysical movement related to Christian Science that stressed that our mental states manifest our reality. Unsurprisingly, they stressed the importance of positive thinking. Two, theories of telepathy, and lastly, the theory of conscious autosuggestion developed by the French pharmacist Émile Coué, whom Rivkin greatly admired. Coué advocated for self-healing through autosuggestion, instructing people to recite every day the mantra, day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better, or Tag zu Tag, ich will besser und besser, as Rivkin put it in Yiddish. Coué's ideas were wildly popular in the 1920s, and Rivkin/Toleros popularized them among Yiddish readers in countless newspaper articles. It was important to Rivkin to stress that all occult phenomena took place within the realm of the living. Ghost sightings, he wrote, were real, and that the person seeing the ghost was not hallucinating and had in fact seen a real entity. This entity, however, the ghost, was not the spirit of a dead person now returned to the world of the living, but rather a materialized astral projection subconsciously created by the person witnessing the ghost. Makes sense, right? For example, per Rivkin, were I to be visited by the ghost of my dear departed grandmother, I would not be seeing her spirit, but rather a materialization of whatever image of her is in my mind, projected by my mind onto my surrounding environment to the point that the thought took material form. Now, if you were to ask, what if I saw the image of someone I didn't know? Well, maybe that was a subconscious telepathic communication received from long distance from someone else. You see, it gets very complicated. Rivkin likewise felt very strongly it was not possible to contact the spirits of the dead, and that the spirit communications allegedly received at séances were in fact the product of the thought forces of those present and not the dead. With that said, Rivkin had a complicated relationship with spiritualism. While he openly declared that he was not a spiritualist, even publishing an article titled "Why I Am Not a Spiritualist," his daughter Yvette West recalled in an interview with Paul Buell that Rivkin would visit a spiritualist medium on the occasion of his first wife's yahrzeit, in lieu of, or perhaps in addition to, saying Kaddish. And he frequently wrote about spiritualism in his columns. All in all, in writing about the occult, Rivkin/Toleros wished for his readers to be amazed by the powers of the human mind, and as a result, come to a newfound optimism and belief in the power of the human spirit. This was an integral part of his larger political project. Only through believing in themselves and the great spiritual powers within them could the Jewish people find the strength to redeem themselves and the world around them. While Rivkin's understanding of occult phenomena as the products of human thought forces, remained fairly consistent over his career, his specific aims or the framework in which he wrote about the occult were far more dynamic. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the first Toleros column, Foundergeist from the spirit world, appeared in Der Tag in May 1919 and was published more or less weekly for 6 months until November of that year. From the beginning, these articles generated considerable interest among Yiddish readers who wrote to Rivkin to share their own paranormal experiences. While the material for his articles were initially taken primarily from the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research and other occult scientific publications, he quickly incorporated reader letters into his column, oftentimes publishing a recent letter from a reader at the beginning of an article. Unfortunately, no reader letters from this period are preserved in Rivkin's archive, but it's clear that a not insignificant number of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe had undergone experiences they considered paranormal, and, having heard of a journalist interested in hearing about them, were quite eager to share them. By publicly and unabashedly discussing occult ideas and paranormal experiences, Rivkin legitimized occult discourse among Yiddish-speaking American Jews. That Mark Toleros was in fact the respected intellectual and critic B. Rivkin was an open secret. And publishing his articles, he softened taboos around discussing paranormal experiences or occult beliefs in polite company. As an aside, Rivkin's reputation as an occultist is memorialized in the Yiddish writer Lambert Shapiro's 1931 story Doc, in which one of the characters notes that B. Rivkin is absorbed in occultism, the world soul, and a few thousand other matters. Years later, Rivkin looked back at what had led him to start the Foundergeist column. He was enamored at the time, he wrote, by psychical research, the scientific investigation of occult phenomena, and he wished to become a psychical researcher himself. But what was he to do? As a starving Yiddish journalist, he lacked the means to conduct experiments or establish his own laboratory, nor did he have learned colleagues with whom to investigate psychic phenomena. His solution then was to launch an occultism column in the popular Yiddish press that would be a partnership with his readers, who upon reading his first articles would then send in their own accounts for him to analyze. Rivkin here is seemingly borrowing the Zomler methodology employed by contemporary Jewish folklorists and institutions such as YIVO, who relied upon Zomlers, or collectors in Yiddish, to collect raw folkloric data that they would then pass on to folklorists to sort out and analyze. Rivkin's Toleros column was, one could say, Zomler parapsychology. Foundergeist came to an end in November 1919, and following a year-long hiatus, the Toleros columns resumed intermittently starting in October 1920 in Die Zeit, a Yiddish daily paper published in New York by the Poalei Zion labor Zionist movement in America. These first articles were not part of a dedicated named column, however, until August 1921, when Rivkin, as Toleros, launched the new occult column called Natur und Wunder, or Nature and Miracle, to use Rivkin's preferred translation, devoted to publishing accounts of astonishing phenomena. Natur und Wunder itself appeared at an astonishing clip, with Rivkin publishing a new article on prophetic dreams, telepathy, or sleepwalking and the like almost every single day for several months. By early 1922, when Die Zeit folded, nearly 100 articles had come out. Rivkin's vision for the column was encapsulated in his tagline, Die Natur ist wunderlich und Wunder seien natürlich. Nature is miraculous and miracles are natural. In line with this naturalistic understanding of the occult, Rivkin wished to include occult phenomena within the boundaries of science, while expanding those very boundaries to include hitherto unacknowledged psychic forces. By claiming that seemingly miraculous occurrences could be subject to scientific explanations, albeit a scientific explanation that could include psychic powers, Rivkin was translating the traditional language of the supernatural into a language more palatable for the secularized readers of Die Zeit, and thus presenting the occult as a sort of surrogate metaphysics for the secular age. The Natur and Wunder columns discuss contemporary cultural developments from a parapsychological perspective. And following the American stage debut of Ansky's famous play, The Dybbuk, in early September 1921, Rivkin/Toleros devoted several articles to recent real-life Dybbuk cases, which he preferred to explain as instances of multiple personality disorder. He likewise devoted several articles to a lengthy critical review of Aleph Almi's Das zweite Existenz, The Second Existence, the first ever book in Yiddish on spiritualism, which came out that year in New York. In December 1921, an advertisement appeared in Die Zeit announcing the forthcoming debut in January 1922 of a new monthly Yiddish journal called Der Neue Emes, The New Truth, under the joint editorship of, listen carefully, B. Rivkin, Abba Lillian, and Mark Toleros, i.e., three of Rivkin's pen names brought together. This was truly a collaboration between his various journalistic personas. As per the advertisement, the journal was going to be devoted to literature, theater, and psychical research. In addition, the journal was to cover the theory and practice of character transformation, a common theme in occult literature, and the propagandization of Messiah thought, Mashiach Gedanke. Here we see the intersection of Rivkin's NeoMessianism, the theology of social revolution, and Toleros' occult doctrine of psychic powers. This intersection is drawn into further relief by the slogan found toward the bottom of the ad: to social revolution by way of spiritual revolution, world salvation by way of Jewish salvation. By pursuing art and the development of psychic powers, the advertisement seems to promise, Jews might bring about a social revolution that will bring salvation to the entire world. In actuality, the journal would only launch in March of 1922 under the name Natur und Wunder, or Nature and Miracle, the same name of Rivkin's column at the soon-to-be defunct Die Zeit. I'm confident going out on a limb and saying that this was one of the most unusual Yiddish periodicals ever published. It claimed to be published by the New Thought Publishing Company Incorporated, an otherwise non-existent publishing house whose address appears to be a rented room several doors down from the offices of Der Tog on Lower East Side of Manhattan. The journal attempted to combine Rivkin's twin interests in the arts and occultism. This incongruity was reflected in the journal's tagline, which changed from issue to issue as if Rivkin couldn't quite figure out what the journal was all about. The first issue declared that it was a, quote, weekly magazine for enlightenment about the hidden powers in people who build their life and destiny, with sections for theater, art, literature, and problems of the hour addressed in light of a new philosophy of life. After several variations, the journal ultimately settled on, quote, a weekly magazine that instructs people how to develop their hidden powers for health and happiness, shows theater a new mission, addresses life questions in light of a new philosophy called Neo-Hasidism. After all that, the journal then folded after only 6 issues. Rivkin's name here for his new philosophy of life, Neo-Hasidism, was a reference to the then fashionable literary Neo-Hasidism popularized by writers such as I.L. Peretz, Micha Yosef Berdichevsky, and Martin Buber. Yet his Neo-Hasidism, he claimed, was far superior to those writers' neo-romantic literary depictions of religious life, and that his was a scientific investigation of phenomena previously relegated to religion, such as ecstasy and altered states of consciousness. The scientific investigation of psychic states, the journal declared, was, quote, practical Hasidism. Sticking with the theme of Hasidism, the first issue opened with an article presenting the Baal Shem Tov, the legendary founder of Hasidism, as a medium. What else was found in this Yiddish journal for psychical research? Rivkin published articles on dreams and nature healing, including a letter from a reader who claimed to have healed himself from the Spanish flu using only autosuggestion. Don't try that at home. Included instructions for developing powers of clairvoyance, poems by the Yiddish poets Moishe Halpern and Hey Leivik, a serialized Yiddish translation of Gustav Meyrink's novel The Golem, and article upon article presenting accounts of psychic experiences collected from readers. In fact, a note in the second issue announced a psychical research discussion group held in the Natur und Wunder editorial office every Friday night. Each person was invited to bring their own paranormal occurrence to share with the group. In the fifth issue of Natur und Wunder, a brief notice announced a new regular contributor to the journal, none other than the famous Russian theosophist Nicholas Roerich. The announcement was accompanied by an article by Roerich, written specifically for the journal, titled Redemptive Art. Roerich and his wife Helena were the heads of a particularly messianic independent faction within the Theosophical Society, the esoteric movement founded by Madame Helena Blavatsky in 1875, that by the 1920s had tens of thousands of followers across the globe, including many Jews. The Roerichs, Nicholas and Helena, had fled Russia following the revolution in 1917 and arrived in New York City in 1920, the same year that they launched their own theosophical doctrine called Agni Yoga. Many in the Theosophical Society follow the teachings of the Mahatmas, mysterious adepts said to dwell somewhere in the Himalayas, who communicated via psychic means. And the patron Mahatma, so to speak, of Agni Yoga was named Master Morya. Nicholas Roerich was a renowned painter, and like Rivkin, he believed that artistic expression was a necessary precondition for achieving redemption. How did Roerich, a Russian theosophist in exile, end up publishing in Natur und Wunder? When the Roerichs arrived in New York City 2 years earlier, they quickly gathered around themselves a new circle of disciples. These disciples, it turns out, were nearly entirely Jewish, including the pianists Maurice and Sima Lichtman, Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who are friendly with Rivkin. Here you can see a picture of the Roerich's inner circle. Nearly every person in this picture is Jewish. Helena Roerich recorded in her diary on March 14th, 1922, shortly after the release of the first issue of Natur und Wunder, that Master Morya himself contacted her at a séance with instructions to reach out to Rivkin, presumably to partner in spreading the doctrine of Agni Yoga in his journal. We see that Rivkin acquiesced and went so far as to declare that he and Roerich shared the same belief, that redemption would come through art. Rivkin published a long article in the next issue called Mashiach kommt ins Spiel, The Messiah Comes in Play, in which he describes meeting with Roerich and sharing his messianic mission, and declares that the Messiah will come on September 27th, 1931, perhaps not incidentally, Roerich's birthday on the Julian calendar. Helena Roerich's diary records that 2 weeks later, the Lichtmans held a séance in which Morya contacted them with the following message: be able to convey the essence of my teaching to the pure hearts. Mark the number 27 as a beginning. We rejoice at Rivkin's deed. We need to remember the day of the magazine's release. This sort of clipped style is standard for séance protocols, or at least that's what they tell me. Natur und Wunder, then, was not just a Yiddish parapsychology magazine, but also a partner in the esoteric messianic mission of the Roerich Theosophical Circle to redeem the world, a state of spiritual salvation that Rivkin believed went hand in hand with socioeconomic revolution. While Natur und Wunder folded after only one more issue, Rivkin continued to maintain social ties with the Lichtmans and even sent his daughter to them for piano lessons. The framework of this talk doesn't permit me to fully do justice to Natur und Wunder, but let me simply note that as we have seen, Rivkin in his journal brought together several ostensibly unrelated discursive knots: social revolution, parapsychology, New Thought-esque self-development, neo-Hasidism, and lastly, the theosophical doctrine of Nicholas and Helena Roerich. All of this in Yiddish. All in all, we see the potential here of occult ideas to join together with modern Jewish culture and left-wing politics. In the time that remains, I want to jump forward 20 years to 1942. Rivkin at that time had returned to writing to Der Tog and had last intermittently published Toleros articles in the spring and summer of the year before, 1941. Now, on August 29th, 1942, he announced a new Toleros column devoted entirely to dreams, called Was erzählt euch euer Cholem? What does your dream tell you? He issued an appeal for readers to write to him with dream accounts and other psychic experiences, which he published alongside his interpretation. Was was a big hit, and it appeared in Der Tag with few interruptions every Saturday until shortly before Rivkin's death in 1945. The decision to launch a dream interpretation column was precipitated by the crisis of World War II and the growing recognition of the catastrophe that faced the Jews of Eastern Europe. Rivkin writes in the first article of the series, "It is Elul, the time leading up to the high holidays, the Yamim Noraim. It is a terrible time, Yamim Noraim, for the entire world. It is the right time to undertake an accounting, a cheshbon nefesh. Every person must ask themselves, who am I? Where do I stand in the world?" But a cheshbon nefesh is not such an easy thing to do. There is an easier path to introspection. Examine your dreams, inquire into what they know about you, and know that they know a lot. They convey the deepest knowledge about a person. The dream is a door to one's soul. Or as a modern psychologist would put it, the dream is the self-portrait of man's inner life. 1/10 of what a person knows is in conscious knowledge, 9/10 is in the subconscious. Dreams rise up from the subconscious, bearing one's deepest secrets. They tell him that which he's been looking for his entire life. If this sounds pretty Freudian to you, you're right. Yet Rivkin in this next paragraph rejects Freudian dream interpretation, preferring instead to return to the traditional method of dream amelioration, or hatavat chalom in Hebrew, found in the Jewish prayer book. His critique of Freud centers around what he sees as Freud's excessive focus on negative impulses. Traditional Jewish dream interpretation, by contrast, with its exclamations of chalma tava, or good dream in Aramaic, consists of seeking out the positive elements of the dream and not giving voice to any negative parts. In line with this new thought and autosuggestion influenced method of dream interpretation, autosuggestion influenced worldview that mental states determine reality, Rivkin's method of dream interpretation was to seek out the positive element in any dream in order to impart strength and encouragement to the dreamer, with the understanding that a positive outlook would lead to a positive outcome. Being Toleros, of course, his dream interpretations were filled with notions such as thought materialization, telepathy, and cosmic consciousness, all utilized to offer a positive interpretation. With that, it was the midst of the Holocaust, and he was dealing with some very dark dreams. Years later, the Hebrew and Yiddish writer Aaron Zeitlin, himself a devoted student of parapsychology, described Rivkin's dream column as, quote, a sort of psychic responsa, and the dreams sent to him by readers stand to tell us a great deal about the mental state of Yiddish-speaking Jews living in America during World War II. As I said, Rivkin's readers are having some pretty dark dreams during the Holocaust, and he acknowledged as much. His column of April 15th, 1944, opens with the subtitle, this is fairly shocking, Hitler Dream Contest. He writes, "If I were to hold a Hitler dream contest, I would need to put aside thousands to distribute as prizes. For there is no Jew who hasn't dreamed a horrible Hitler nightmare. What this shows is that we are more disturbed than our waking pretenses make things out to be. The usual formula of the Hitler dream, we suddenly fall into a Nazi death trap. There's no way out, there's no escape. We are resolved to die." Rivkin published several such Hitler dreams in his column. We don't have much time left, so I'll just share one Hitler dream sent to Rivkin by a woman whose name is given only as MBR. The dream goes as follows. The Nazis enter the shtetl and immediately begin purging Jews. I'm in our large room. Several young Nazis stand in front of me with guns. I look them straight in the eye and say nothing. One of the young men lowers his head, as if ashamed. They don't shoot me, but they give me a poison shaped like an oblong piece of chocolate cake served in a saucer. I eat without protest. I eat it all up, and I'm glad that I'm dying an easier death than being shot by the guns. I fall on the floor. Smoke pours out of my mouth. I lie for a few minutes and then begin to rise up. They are frightened and give me a punch. What is this? I hear a command, more poison. A finely dressed woman emerges from a side room that looks like a ship's cabin. In her hand, she holds a tray with another big helping of poison. The first dose was carried to me by Hitler himself. I eat it all up, and I die, but with no fear. The body remains lying on the floor, and I run off through the air and think to myself, there is such beauty after death as well. As I'm thinking this thought, my father, who I last saw living in the shtetl, appears before me. I throw myself at my father and lay my hand on his breast and come back to life. The Nazis aim their guns at us, but my father and I run away. I woke up certain that my father is alive. This woman's dream reflects the cruel reality that by 1944, many thousands of American Jews had not heard from their relatives back in Europe for several years and could only rely upon their dreams for any indication of their loved one's well-being. Rivkin / Toleros, for his part, presents this dream as a statement of defiance. The certainty that her father lives, he wrote in Der Tag, colors the whole dream and softens the Nazi terror. There's even a Nazi who feels shame. The beautiful woman is the German people who dutifully carry out Hitler's order. This is also the consolation that we Jews do not die. We will survive. Other Holocaust dreams were of a more psychic nature. In an article from earlier in the war titled, She Saw from New York How Her Husband Perished in Hitler's Concentration Camp, Rivkin / Toleros published the dream of a German refugee named Dina Weistuch, who arrived in New York in 1939 without her husband, who had stayed behind to manage his accounting firm. For more than 14 months, Rivkin wrote, she had not heard from her husband, when last October she received word from his family in Lublin that he had been taken by the Nazis. No more than that was known. Early in the morning of Wednesday, April 2nd at 4 a.m., she suddenly awoke in terror. She can't remember now if it was a dream or real, but she clearly saw her husband, emaciated and covered in blood. He stood at the threshold of her bedroom and with one hand held his head and with the other hand called to her to save him. Miss Weistuch was startled and jumped out of bed and ran to the bloody figure standing by her door, but the figure had already vanished. Friday morning, she received a telegram from Lublin that her husband was dead. He had died on Wednesday, April 2nd, killed by the Nazi murderers. Miss Weistuch was physically and psychologically weakened by what happened and was greatly disturbed by the image of her bloodied husband that she beheld at the very moment of his death. Dina Weistuch then turned to Rivkin, the veteran Yiddish occultist, for an explanation of her experience, which he published in the paper alongside her dream. This is what he wrote. On the basis of the material my readers have presented me, he wrote, I have come across phantoms, meaning dreams that project images that are visible to the eye. These phantoms, just like dreams themselves, can bring messages from a great distance and convey prophecy and healing. However, I firmly maintain that these phantoms, even of the dead, are only images produced by dreams and not the spirits of the dead themselves. But what consolation would it be for Ms. Weistuch if I should tell her that it was not her husband that she saw, but only a dream image of him? This would amount to, God forbid, taking her husband away from her a second time. I would be robbing her of the last hope that perhaps his spirit lives on in the next world. It's very interesting to see here how Rivkin publicly shares his doubts as to whether his psychic paradigms would be psychologically beneficial for Mrs. Weistuch. Was his role as dream interpreter to convey the truth as he understood it, or to offer comfort and assurance to people found in the most difficult of circumstances? Rivkin / Toleros here managed to do both, telling Ms. Weistuch that she had received a telepathic dispatch from her husband at the moment of his death, quote, in order to provide her with encouragement that she should continue to relive the happiest moments from their life together and receive the courage to live. Rivkin encouraged her to ignore the fact that he was emaciated and covered in blood. Reading the Voster Sel Ech Eir Cholam articles, it becomes increasingly clear that American Jews in the early 1940s were, to borrow Rivkin's formulation, more disturbed than their waking pretenses make things out to be. American Jews dreamed of death and destruction and were haunted by visions of forsaken loved ones left behind in Europe. Yet Rivkin's interpretations and his aim in publishing these frightening dreams was avowedly positive, even constructive. Having perceived dreams not only as windows into the soul, but also as a source of wonderment and belief in inner psychic powers, Rivkin publicized allegedly psychic dreams in order that his readers might believe in themselves and their latent powers. A devoted believer in the power of autosuggestion, for Rivkin, belief in the eternal power of the Jewish spirit, as represented by psychic powers, would be enough to ensure Jewish survival in the face of the greatest tragedy of Jewish history. Now I'm going to wrap up. This point emerges most clearly in one of his final articles in the Vostir Zetach Archolam column from early February 1945, in which Rivkin looked back at his career as Mark Toleros. What is this whole Toleros enterprise for? He asked his readers. The answer? There are those who think that everything written in the newspaper is mere entertainment. They do not understand that a newspaper, particularly a Yiddish newspaper, must address the needs of the hour. And what is our greatest need at this hour? We need to take a forceful stand against our dreadful misfortune, with the power that will rescue us from our tragic helplessness. And the main reason for our sense of helplessness is that we have lost our eternal Jewish faith in the power of spirit. The secret is that when one believes that the psyche is a force, then there is a force. If one does not believe, the power is weakened. The disbelief overwhelms us with weakness. What am I doing? I gather facts that ought to convince people that a psychic force is active in every one of us. Everybody will believe in themselves and their own experiences, and the more one believes in a psychic force, the more that force is revealed. If I have proved it, I will pass the proof on to myself, to all of the Jewish people. I do not wish to divulge more about this. I have promised, and I will keep my word, that in 2 articles from now, when I will have finished writing about the medium Eileen Garrett, I will pass on to my readers my primary source of wonder facts, and I need to hurry. I have a premonition that 1945 will put an end to my whole Toleros enterprise. Rivkin's impending demise was, unfortunately, even more impending than he anticipated. After publishing the 2 aforementioned articles on the medium Eileen Garrett, Rivkin fell ill and swiftly died before managing to publish the promised article revealing the full truth behind his Toleros enterprise. Baruch Rivkin, or Mark Toleros, may have died before having the opportunity to sum up his own legacy, but my remarks today are a first step in retelling the story of his lifelong engagement with the occult, and by extension, the broader story of Yiddish occultism in North America. As we have seen, as Mark Toleros, Rivkin was instrumental in popularizing occult paradigms among Yiddish readers, and normalized discussion of occult topics in the Yiddish press. In doing so, he provided his secularizing readers with the paradigm for which to maintain belief in hidden realities, a surrogate metaphysics, if you will. Secondly, Rivkin incorporated an interest in occult phenomena with his vision of Jewish and world redemption and social revolution. His Yiddish parapsychology journal, Natur und Wunder, was a unique combination of modern secular Yiddish culture and the paranormal. Lastly, during the terrible years of the Holocaust, he solicited dreams from his readers in order to awaken wonder among them, in order that they have the self-confidence to carry on. In doing so, he generated a valuable record of the psychological state of many American Jews during the Holocaust. What I have presented today is just a small part of the larger story of East European Jewish occultism, a story I hope to continue to uncover in future studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was really fascinating look at through a window of Jewish history and culture that we don't typically get. It's not, having myself having done a bit of work on Jewish occultism and clairvoyance. I know that this is not a typical theme or topic chosen in Jewish historiography. So I just want to quickly ask, how did you get interested in this topic?
Thanks, Eddie. That's a great question. Sort of my entry point into this whole topic of Jewish occultism was through reading the writings of the famous neo-Hasidic Jewish thinker Hillel Zeitlin, who lived in Warsaw for many years, who in one of his articles that I was reading, even before I started my undergraduate degrees many years ago, Zeitlin has an article in which he tries to defend and legitimize the belief in prophetic dreams. And his means of presenting prophecy in sort of a scientifically tenable way was to quote German parapsychologists and hypnotists. And this sort of intrigued me, why is that more convincing? And that led me down to a whole rabbit hole of Jewish engagement with different occult currents, which led me to Rivkin, as he's one of the people who wrote more about the occult than just about any other Jewish writer in his time.
And Rivkin, of course, what's interesting to me is, years ago, I remember coming across Rivkin's writings on anarchism, something he's a little bit better known for. And what's fascinating here is what appears to be a leftist Jewish intellectual who sort of retains the deep religiosity of his youth, but has directed it somewhere else. But sort of remains deeply Jewish, and I think that's one of the interesting aspects, of Rivkin. We have a bunch of questions, and I want to get to them. So one of the first questions, CT Magaha has a few questions for us here. He wants to know, or he or she, I don't know who or they. Wants to know if there's more of Rivkin's work available online. I think there is, but it's in Yiddish. And they also ask if you've ever translated any of his work, or if you have plans to, and also if you have some favorite 20th century Jewish/Yiddish occultists.
Those are some great questions. I will answer them in order. So Rivkin in his lifetime published all of his works either in Yiddish literary journals. These are more of his sort of more dense literary criticism articles, and he also published articles in the Yiddish press. After he died, his widow put together a bunch of books by sort of collecting articles, a mix of articles from these literary journals and a mix of some more of the heavier, more developed articles from the Yiddish press. And published them, and those have all been scanned, made available online through the website of the Yiddish Book Center. But that's only a drop in the sea of what he wrote, and most of what he wrote, you have to sort of dig through the Yiddish press to find it. In the last few years, there's been a real revolution of digitizing historic Jewish newspapers, and a lot of the papers that Rivkin wrote for have been made available online, but not all of them. In fact, probably not even most of them. So to really find his work, you have to really comb through a lot of microfilms to find his articles. In terms of translation, I haven't translated any of his work myself, and I don't currently have plans to. His book, one of his books is called The Glauben für Ungläubige, A Belief for Unbelievers, where he sort of lays out his messianism, was actually translated into English in the 1950s by the Jewish anarchist Abba Gordin, and there's a manuscript of the translation in his archive. There's one problem, though, is that Abba Gordin really didn't know English, because he also, like Rivkin, was a Russian immigrant who learned English from reading books. So I looked at this manuscript, and it's entirely unusable. I mean, I think Gordin, this is Rivkin in Gordin's language, will say things like he'll call something the acme of nincompooperi, or things like, I mean, it makes no sense. So it's kind of unfortunate. In terms of my other favorite occultists, aside from Rivkin, there was another Yiddish writer and colleague of Rivkin's and friend named Aleph Almi, who I mentioned briefly in my talk, who wrote the first Yiddish book on spiritualism, and he and Rivkin corresponded quite a bit. There's a great line in a letter from Almi to Rivkin, where Almi says that his wife can't stand any of this occult stuff, and she wishes he would drop it. But in fact, she's actually a fantastic medium, but he can't tell her that because it'll drive her nuts. Sort of a comic situation. So yeah, I've also published some articles that are available either online, or you can email me about some other Jewish occultists, such as Hillel Zeitlin or the Rabbi Eliyahu Mordechai Volkovsky, who Eddie mentioned I just published an article on. I'll let Eddie send other questions my way.
Okay. So Daniel Schwartz asks, if you could say more about the larger context of Yiddish socialists and anarchists in this period who combined appreciation for, in quotes, religion, and even in some case orthodoxy, for example, Itzhak Nachman Steinberg, Avram Bick, with a staunch commitment to social revolution. What does this seem to come? Why does this seem to come together specifically in the interwar period and even in the 1940s?
So that's a great question. It also sounds like from the detail of the question that you probably know the answer I'm about to say, that there was a very interesting movement within Jewish anarchism in the 1930s, in particular leading into the 40s, of sort of a return to religion. Anarchism in general, and particularly Jewish anarchism, has a reputation for being staunchly anti-religious and very atheist. And that was true for the beginning of Jewish anarchism. But there was a turn in the 1930s and 40s among some anarchists such as Rivkin or Abba Gordino, I mentioned, and several others, to try to return to the Jewish heritage, not necessarily return to orthodoxy or observance of Jewish law, but a sort of a realization that their social mission could only really be accomplished through recreating and re-engaging with Jewish tradition, albeit often on their own terms. Now, there were figures you mentioned like Avram Bick or Yitzhak Nachman Steinberg, who were Orthodox Jews and who were also anarchists. And you might be familiar, there is a new book by my friend Chaim Rothman, who I mentioned, I have it right here, No Masters But God, Portraits of Anarcho-Judaism, that I highly recommend. He deals with a lot of these figures. And although not Rivkin, but as I mentioned, he is working on Rivkin and his NeoMessianism for his upcoming project.
This isn't a question from the audience, but it's a question of mine. I'm wondering what the response of other Yiddish-speaking or Jewish intellectuals was to Rivkin's interest in the occult. Was there any criticism of it or support from different precincts?
So as I mentioned, there is that as I shared, there is that line from the Lama Shapiro novel where the character sort of disparagingly mentions Rivkin's interests. I mean, it's a good question because it's something that everyone knew about. It's not like he was using his pen name as an actual pseudonym. And you find that in a lot of tributes written to him after his death, there is mention made of the Toleros articles, but it seems that most of the intellectuals, most of his colleagues within the Jewish intelligentsia, were not super moved by these articles. The only person who really writes the only two people who really praise Rivkin's occult writings are Aleph Almi, who was himself a spiritualist, and the Hebrew writer Avram Regelson, who, if you actually read Rivkin's dream columns, is sending Rivkin all these paranormal experiences he had. So he also, so to speak, sort of on the same team. But no, I think that has to do with why this part of Rivkin's legacy has been totally forgotten and why he's best known just for his anarchist stuff, because the people who were sort of writing the history, the intellectuals, didn't really want to preserve this part. There's a claim Rivkin's daughter claims that when his second wife, her stepmother, edited his books, she censored them to make them less, to make them less occult. But I actually found indications that his widow actually was trying to publish his occult writings and couldn't find a publisher. And it also seems that his daughter really did not like her stepmom. So it's hard to know how seriously to take her claims.
Right. But so that, nothing appears, let's say, in the Freiheit excoriating Rivkin for this kind of activity.
The Freiheit specifically, I haven't gone through thoroughly enough to be able to answer your question with any confidence. But in the Freiheit, for example, like in the Freiheit, they publish things by Rivkin or also by things by Almi on spiritualist things. But there in the Freiheit, the anarchist paper, they're, as anarchists, they're a little bit more open-minded.
Right. All right. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. I just want to point out that Barbara Drench, who's one of the funders of this fellowship lecture, comments that it's a wonderful presentation. And she asks, you already somewhat answered this fashion. Where did your fascination with Rivkin and occultism come from? And what do you plan to do with this material once you're finished with your research?
Thank you very much. As I mentioned, I came to Rivkin through my general interest in Jewish occultism. I'm currently writing my PhD dissertation on Jewish occultism in Eastern European Jewish contexts. And so some of the Rivkin material, although not all of it, will probably end up there. I imagine I'll probably end up publishing 1 or 2 articles. There are hundreds of dreams that I've been pouring through, some of which are quite moving or disturbing, and I think those would probably be of some interest to translate and to publish. I also want to mention that if anyone wants to be in touch with me, they should feel free to send me an email. If you Google my name, you'll come to my academia page, and that has my email address there.
Well, one last question from Miriam Hoffman, and she asked, when and how did Jewish occultism go out of style, or did it go out of style?
Yeah, I mean, I would question the assumptions in the question. I think that occultism, sort of the occult forms that were very fashionable in the early 20th century, like the séances and the hypnotism, things like that, that sort of dies out worldwide, really with World War II, and then also shortly after World War II. But it gets very quickly replaced by all sorts of New Age movements and alternative spiritual movements or new religious movements that are really picking up from right where the occult left off. So I think that if I think New Age things today, and you have the same interest in astrology and natural healing methods and things like that, when I'm reading descriptions of occult gatherings from 100 years ago, it sounds just like things I'm reading about. It sounds just like what I read about the hippies, 1960s. Just it was their grandparents' generation.
Right. And lastly, I just want to ask, because you said that Rivkin died before providing his explanation for what the Toleros experiment was, the Toleros enterprise was. What do you think it was?
I think that Rivkin, that's a great question. I think Rivkin drops out of hints that I think what he's trying to do is to awaken wonder. He didn't like it that he was unhappy with the state of affairs, that people thought that there was nothing beyond what they could see with their own eyes, and he wanted people to look a little bit deeper, and especially to look a little bit deeper within themselves.
Right. Great. Thank you so much, Sam. This was really thought-provoking, compelling, really a fascinating topic. We really appreciate you're doing the research, and we're thrilled that you were able to do this as a YIVO fellow. Once again, I want to thank the Drench and Tedler families for supporting this fellowship. If you like what you see and heard, please consider donating to YIVO. We can't do any of this without your support. So please help us when and where you can. Once again, thank you to all of you for joining us, and thanks especially to Sam Glauber-Zimra for providing us with a really genuinely fascinating lecture. Thank you.